Orloff is done. We shut the noisy pump off and start switching out our manifold again. Okay, so what we're doing at this point is we're running off our wort from the kettle. So we're just very slowly starting to pour the wort as it comes off of the mash into the boiling kettle. So now, as this wort is running off, first thing I'm going to do is grab a sample so I can check the specific gravity and see how much sugar's in the wort as it's coming off. We have various quality control processes that we do throughout the day. We'll set that aside to check later. We'll check the pH, specific gravities, monitor the beer and make sure that everything's working the way it's supposed to. And then we're going to take the rest of the hot water that we have in the hot liquor tank and we're going to start putting more hot water up here on top. So this part of the process, what I call the sparge, or other people call it the water part of the process, is basically a sequence where you've got about the same amount of water coming in on top of the grain, and you want to try to match that to the amount of wort that's coming off the bottom. So in the bottom of the mash lauter tun, and we'll see this later when we clean it out, there's a series of screens that form a false bottom on the bottom of the mash tun. So all of the grain is going to stay in here in the mash tun, and all we're doing at this point in the process is extracting the sugars from that mashing process that we did earlier, where we converted the starch in the grain into sugar. All that sugar-laden liquid called wort is being extracted from the grain and transferred over to the boiling kettle. That's what we're going to use. So one of the very frequent questions that I get is, what in the world do you do with all of the grain after you get done brewing? Because we extract all of the sugar into the water, and that's what we use to make the beer. But when we get done, we have a couple hundred pounds worth of soggy, wet grain left over. So, all of this spent grain, we basically take most of it and send it out to a local farmer, and he uses that to feed to his pigs. Feeds about 8 hogs a year off of what we provide to him. We also use the spent grain in our ciabatta beer bread here at the brewery, and we make wonderful brew biscuits for your dog. What I'm getting ready to do now is weigh out some of the hops to add later on in the process. We're brewing the belligerent ass nut brown. The bittering hops that I use in the belligerent ass are Galena. I have about 11 different varieties of hops that we use. They all have different flavor and aroma characteristics. We use differing amounts, add them at different times during the boil. Hops that are added early in the boil give the beer more bitterness. Midway, towards the end of the boil, we'll get more flavor. And if we add the hops towards the end of the boil, we'll get more aroma. And for some of our beers, for example, the grog or the Liftline Lager, Superstition, our Halloween beer, we will also dry hop the beer, which means we add the hops in the fermenter or in one of the bright beer tanks after the beer has finished fermenting. And that gives it flavor and more aroma characteristics. Now, as you can see from this, our hops are basically pelletized. They're a flower cone off of a vine. These have all been pelletized. These are a bit little fatter pellets. That's Galena. And then we're going to add for our final hop addition on this beer some Willamette. And these are a little bit smaller pellets. These are more typical of most of the hops that we use. So throw some of these in here. And you'll notice these pellets are a little smaller and a little tighter. Basically looks like rabbit food. Okay, so we're just about done running off all of our wort into the kettle, and we're starting to bring it up to a boil. Boil in Pocatello is 204 degrees because of the elevation that we're at. So it'll take a little bit longer to get it towards a good rolling boil, and then we'll add the hops at that point. Okay, so now that the wort is to a boil, we will add our bittering hops. So it's going to boil like this for a while, and then we'll pump it over to the fermenter and feed the yeast. Okay, so now we're ready to pump the beer over into the fermenters. All of the boil is finished, and first thing we're going to do is start running cold water through our heat exchanger, get it cooled down, and we're going to open all of our valves to run the hot beer. It's at 199 degrees right now. We're going to run that through our counterflow heat exchanger to cool it down to around room temperature into the fermenter down here. We already have the yeast waiting in the fermenter, so they're ready to go. Looking forward to something to eat today. And heat exchanger should be cooled down just fine. Flip on our pump. And as we're pumping this over, we check to make sure that the temperature's right. I do this manually, and I also monitor the temperature on our glycol system as well. And as we're pumping the wort over to the fermenter, I also inject oxygen in line. That helps the yeast be able to divide, so they make more yeast cells, so that they have plenty of yeast to be able to convert the sugar that's in the wort into carbon dioxide and alcohol, which is what makes the beer fun. and makes beer beer. So that feels really good. It's going the way it's supposed to. And while that's pumping over, here we have a batch of beer. You can see it blowing off, so we've got the carbon dioxide, the CO2 is being vented off of this batch of beer. This is a batch of Crystal Weizen we brewed earlier. It's an ale. We have the capability of brewing both ales and lagers. Ales ferment at room temperature, roughly 65, 68 degrees. Lagers are fermented at colder temperatures for a little longer period of time, typically 50, 55 degrees for lagers here. After the fermentation is complete, that process takes anywhere from 7 to 14 days. We'll crash the yeast out, reuse the yeast to brew another batch of beer, and then take the beer out of the tank. It's flat at this point, no bubbles involved, no carbonation. We'll transfer it into what's called a bright beer tank. Here we take the temperature down to 34 degrees. It drops the rest of the yeast out of solution. We don't filter any of our beers here at Portage Valley Brewing. We don't put any artificial ingredients in it. No preservatives, no horse hooves, no synthetic clarifying agents. It's just natural beer. What you see going on here, this is a batch of Midnight Satin. We're injecting CO2 in through a centered carbonation stone down here to bring the beer to the proper carbonation level. That process takes 2 to 3 days. We'll let the beer sit in the bright beer tank for typically about a week to finish clarifying, and then we'll pump our CO2 push all of the beer down to the serving tanks that you see in our huge walk-in cooler in the basement. And then it's ready to drink. Alright. After we've finished all of the beer upstairs in the brewery, then we transfer all of that beer down here to a huge walk-in cooler that we have in the basement. We have 9 serving tanks downstairs with all of our beer that's on tap upstairs, as well as some of the beer that's poured off of kegs. All of our cellar operations now are done in the cellar, cleverly enough. All of our beer is kegged directly off of our serving tanks, so any of the beer that goes out to our distributor or to customers that buy kegs to go, all of those transfers are done down here in the walk-in cooler. So we're able to take finished beer, it's completely done, carbonated, ready to drink, and transfer it directly off of the serving tanks into either Sankey half barrels, which we have here, or we also have a large inventory of 5-gallon kegs that we distribute out as well. So we also keep all of our hops down in the cooler, so that those are all cold stored, as well as some wine inventory.
Go, Bob.